All right, good evening, scholars. It's good to have you back this week. Hope you had a wonderful week. We had a little holiday for our church this week that went very well. It was good to see some people back together in person. We haven't had that in a while, obviously because of the COVID. One of the people in our class said something at church, at our church, said something to me about the class. I asked how he thought it was going, and he said it was going great, but he said, I don't know what I'm going to do with all this knowledge, but I'm enjoying the class. So hopefully tonight we'll start seeing some of the puzzle pieces coming together and see how this class and the information we're presenting here can really benefit you in your understanding of the Bible and how you study the Bible moving forward. So that's really kind of the goal here, is to give you some tools that you can use moving forward. And hopefully you'll start seeing some of the stuff coming together tonight. You'll see we're going to build off of the information from the past 2 weeks as we move forward. And that's just going to continue to build as we go to the end of the course. So this is week 3. I will share the screen here. So let's see, screen 2. There we go. All right. This is week 3. Last week we talked about languages, writing materials. We talked about the fact of language was oral at first. Writing came later, obviously, and how storytelling was oral in nature. The stories were being told, and then eventually someone writes these stories down for the preservation of future generations. So this week we're going to dive into the Old Testament. So what this week and next week looks like, we're going to look at the background to the Old Testament this week, historical, a little bit of cultural, what it took to start compiling these scrolls that we talked about last week, and how that kind of took place, and what we have available today as far as resources and how we can study this history of the Bible today, how it's developed over the past 100 years, which is really great. So we'll talk about that this week. If we don't get to everything tonight, we will bleed over to next week. I think we can cover all the material. I kind of have it broken down into 2 sections: the background to the Old Testament, and then we'll take a break. And then from there, we'll go to the transmission of the Old Testament and how it was pushed forward, carried forward, of the Hebrew text. This week, we're dealing with just the Old Testament. Next week, we'll do the same thing with the New Testament. How the New Testament was developed, we'll have the same breakdown, the background to the New Testament. We'll take a break next week, and then we'll dive into the transmission of the New Testament. And understanding how these things came about is definitely gonna, I can't see how it couldn't enhance your view of the biblical text, or how it couldn't enhance your way of studying, your manner of studying moving forward. So we'll dive into a little bit of thing tonight called critical introduction. This is not to be a critical introduction class, but when studying the background, the history of the Bible that we know, we kind of have to deal with that a little bit. Hopefully in the future, that's another course that we can offer here, and really dive in book by book and say, what do we know about each one of these individual books as they stand alone, and then how does that relate to the whole Bible? So we'll take a little snapshot of that tonight, looking at a couple of books, and but that plays a role into the history of the Bible that we know it, and we'll offer something later on for a more in-depth study of all the books. So starting tonight, we will dive into the background here. So a couple of things to think about when we think about the Old Testament. And we looked at the breakdown a couple of weeks ago, just kind of an overview. We're going to dig a little deeper tonight into what these books that we have in the Old Testament look like, how many there are, stuff like that. So this is kind of where we're starting. We're looking at the Old Testament and its place within the Bible. Obviously, everyone knows that the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is what came first. I think everybody is well established in this class that everybody would understand that. I like to refer to it as the Hebrew Bible, but for the sake of understanding for everybody, we're using Old Testament here. But that gives it away in itself, right? The Old Testament, the New Testament, this one came before. So in the English Bible that we have today, we have 39 books. 39 books with around 40 authors. Well, how can that be? This is something that I didn't think about early on in my Bible study. I picked up my Bible and I said, I'm going to study it and we're going to read it, understand it, and God's going to tell me how to live. To think about how many books there were. I mean, as children, we have these vacation Bible schools and they learn the books of the Bible, but to sit down and really think about who wrote these things, how many authors were there? How do we have 39 books and 40 authors? Or at least the way we understand it now. So how do we view that, and how does that affect how we study the Bible moving forward? The Bible, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, covers more than 2,000 years of writing. Now, that's not 2,000 years of storytelling, right? We're talking about the story from creation all the way up until, the exile and shortly thereafter. We're not talking about the storyline here. We're talking about 2,000 years of writing or around that. And what does that mean? We'll see why that is. If Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, that should be drawing a question in your mind as you're looking at this timeline down below. How can he say when Moses is, I would move that line. This is out of one of my textbooks, but I would move that line to Moses to the left a little bit. But if I place Moses even at 1500 BC, how does the Old Testament encompass 2,000 years of writing if he wrote the first ones? That's a good question. The Old Testament covers storytelling from nomads to kingdoms. We're talking about going from a nomadic people, a people that were wanderers. Abraham was a wandering Aramaean. To kingdoms solidified in the nation of Israel, to these great dynasties. King David, who's the most well-known and well-established king of Israel. And then we have going after David into the Assyrians and the Persians, the Greeks, but all of these times of conflict where Israel was faced with many different enemies. We have from the beginning stories of good versus bad. I have a list here. Even going back to creation, you have this idea of the good versus the bad. You have the serpent coming into the garden. You have the Egyptians with the exile. Then you go to Assyria and Babylon. And really what's highlighted here is the fact that I included Israel, because Israel itself becomes its own worst enemy within these texts. So looking at the timeline there below, that's just a general timeline to kind of wrap your head around. We'll talk about some specific dates and stuff like that, but that's just a general timeline that we can view as far as the writing that took place. I believe the writing that took place here, 2,000 years or more. So who wrote the books? We have, we said 40 or so. That's generally speaking. You could add some to that number. You could take away some from that number, but generally speaking, 40 authors of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament text. But who specifically wrote them? We have 14 completely unknown authors. And I don't know about you, when I was early in my study of the Bible and I came across this idea that there were 14 or however many unknown authors in the Bible, I thought, well, wait a minute, every one of my books has a name to it. Jonah, Jeremiah, Joshua, the first 5 books we just throw, together, that's Moses' books. So to me, it was like, well, wait a minute, we have unknown authors. What does that mean? But what does anonymous mean? When we're talking about the writing of the biblical text, what does that mean and how we understand that? When we say that a book has no author, we're not speaking of tradition, because some books in the Bible traditionally are given a title of someone's name or given a title based on authorship. Some books like Samuel, we assume authorship. I know early in my study, I'm thinking this is Samuel's writings. No, it's the writings about Samuel. But what do we mean by anonymous? What that means is the text itself makes no claim of authorship. And if we move forward, the easiest thing to compare that to is the New Testament writings, where we have the letters of Paul that claim authorship. It says, these are my letters from Paul to so-and-so. There's no anonymity there, that we know who wrote those letters. When we talk about some of the prophets in the Old Testament, like Jeremiah, Isaiah, those books claim authorship. These things were written by Jeremiah. These things are written by, but Jeremiah's a little different. We'll talk about Jeremiah in a minute, but these things were written by the people that the text itself makes claim to. So that's what anonymous means. Can we go back in time, or can we study a text somewhat to a place where we can say we understand who wrote this text without its author being established within the text itself? It's possible. Some believe they can do that with the book of Hebrews, or they thought. We've kind of gone away from that in scholarship with the book of Hebrews, but is that possible? Sure. If we discovered something that says that the book of Joshua was written by whoever, or the book of Job was written by this person, we could eventually have some evidence of who it was written by. But as of now, 14, at least in the Old Testament, many more so than the New Testament, right? I mean, we really boil down the New Testament text. They're very easy to ascribe authorship to, aside from the book of Hebrews. So, but in the Hebrew Bible, 14 especially unknown authors, and there may be more. Some books that we think wrote books, it's questionable. I would say, well, we'll talk about it. Well, no, it's down there at the bottom of Lamentations, but for many years we assumed Lamentations to have been authored by Jeremiah. Having studied it, I would say that I don't think that the book was written by Jeremiah. But does it matter? That's the question. Does it matter if we understand who wrote these books? Or does it more matter that the inspiration of God inspired writers to write these books? So that's the first key question we should be asking, looking at the background of the Old Testament. When were they written? That's another key component to it. Now, all these questions are really getting into this idea of critical introduction. That's a area of study that says, how did we get these books? What's the background? And it goes way deeper than what we're talking about tonight. But these questions here are kind of the most baseline questions for critical introduction. Where did these texts come from? When were they written? Who wrote them? Why did they write them? And then there's a lot of details into each one, but we're not trying to do that. But these questions give us an inclination to the history of the text we have. So when were they written? Most of the things, and this was a huge kind of epiphany in my study and my walk, was to understand that the majority of these books were written after the events had taken place. I don't know why I had this idea, and maybe some of you did as well. I had this idea that these books were written in the midst of what was going on, as if they could carry an iPad around with them and record what was going on. That's what we do today, right? We record things because we have technology to do so. Going back to our first class, we have the technology to record events as they happen in real time. So now we get real-time events, real-time recording of those events, and real-time criticism of how well those events are documented. Very different in the ancient world. The importance of detail like we have today was not so in the ancient world. The question was, what's the story being told? What's the message being portrayed? That's where the inspiration comes in. If a scribe put a small incorrect letter at a place in the book of Genesis that is insignificant to the message of Genesis, is that an issue? Or is the message still remain? So, but this was big for me, understanding that most of these texts have been written after the events have taken place. We look at the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis clearly was not written by the person or the people that were going through it. It was the book of Genesis. And we'll talk about the difference between the book of Genesis and the story of Genesis here in a little bit. But was that book that we have today, was it written down by anyone that's told in the story of the book itself? I don't think anybody in the world would think so. The majority of people, to include the first century believers, which includes the Messiah himself, would say that Genesis was a part of the writings of Moses. The book of Exodus, this is one where we have some things that were written down in the midst of. God tells Moses, write these things down right now. The story of Amalek, that's one where they go through this issue with Amalek, and God says, now write this story down. He tells them specifically at that moment to write this down so it's never forgotten, that we must get to a place where Amalek is blotted out of its memory. But the majority of the Exodus text is written after the events of Exodus. We look at Chronicles. Chronicles is telling the same story as Kings, but from a different perspective. written way later, even farther removed from the stories that are told in Kings. So why is Chronicles being written? What's the purpose of writing again and from a different perspective? The books of Samuel, written after the events that took place. When we read the two books of Samuel that were once one book, when we read this storyline of Samuel in these two books, what is the author doing? They're going back and writing about the things that happened before, but why? When were they written, and what does that tell us about the story? The book of Jeremiah, anyone that knows me too well knows Jeremiah has got a soft spot in me. It was the focus of my studies in my master's degree. The book of Jeremiah was written after the events of the exile. Now, he wrote some scrolls in the midst of it. He took scrolls to the king, and those were destroyed. But the book we have today, the first 20 chapters of poetic beauty and the following chapters of the historical relaying of the story of the exile, that was written after the events had taken place. Why do these, what can this tell us? That's kind of what we're asking. When these things are written afterwards, we understand that the author at that point is not recording a news event. It's not news flash from the reporter Jeremiah telling the nation of Israel, the troops are marching in, they're taking over, and we see the bombs going off on TV. It's someone writing a story afterwards to say a certain message. Portions of the Bible were written during the events. This is one, Moses on the mountain. We talked about that. God tells Moses to write specific things down. Or with the one with Amalek, he tells Moses, write this down. Psalms are a unique writing in the Old Testament. It's not narrative, so these things aren't being written. They're being written down long after events. Some Psalms are about the Exodus. Some Psalms are about the kings that are there, about lament of other kings around Israel at the time. But Psalms are being written in its moment with the feelings and the emotions that are going on from the author. So those are part of the Hebrew Bible that are written in the midst of it, not after it necessarily. Lamentations is something that, while I don't believe the author was Jeremiah, the author definitely was someone, notably, in my opinion, a collective people who had witnessed and experienced the exile of Israel and were writing down their emotions concerning that, right in the midst of it. The last question we want to ask is, why were they written? What's the purpose of these books? What's the purpose of having the book of Leviticus, especially today? Some people can't fathom why we would have the book of Leviticus and what importance it would have to believers, especially Christian believers today, or even Jewish believers for that matter, who only focus on the Hebrew Bible. What place does Leviticus have in a world that has no temple, in a world that has no place for the things inside the text? What's the purpose there? This is a famous quote, or not famous. I would say, I don't even know who wrote this, who came up with this phrase to begin with. I know that John Walton has said it. Another scholar has said it. I have no idea the original origin of it. But the books of the Bible, they were written for us. They were written for everyone today, but not to us. So when we think about these questions of its background, you may not have thought about any of these questions. Who cares who wrote Genesis and when? I know it's the first book in my Bible and God wants me to read it. But we have to think about this when we're reading these books so that we better understand what the message that God wants us to understand. Understanding that they were written for us, but not to us. They were written to a people and by a people that lived in a certain era, a certain culture, a certain world. So keep that in mind as we move forward. So I'm going to take a couple of texts here. This is what I was talking about. We're going to take a couple of books and we're going to kind of apply these questions to it and see how understanding these backgrounds to the text of the Hebrew Bible can give us better understanding to what's going on. So the first book we're going to look at here is Genesis. So this is Genesis as an example of these questions. So who wrote it? Did Moses write it? We have many texts that tell us that refers to the Torah of Moses, going back very much in history. But what does Genesis say? And this is the question. Does Genesis tell us who wrote the text? It doesn't. Genesis doesn't tell us that Moses wrote it. I would say that I believe that Moses wrote it. We have some examples here, Exodus 17 and Numbers 33, where God tells Moses specifically to write down some historical events. While those texts don't tell us that God expounded upon the entire creation story and told him to write all of those things down, they are an example of God taking Moses aside and saying, please write these historical events down. We know that God directly spoke to Moses and was capable of doing these things. But did Moses write it? Did Moses have the information at hand? And this is the real question when it comes to the most ancient texts like Genesis and some would say Job, even though I believe that's a much later text. Did Moses have the information at hand? Did he already have these stories in some form or fashion, and God inspired him to write it in a certain way? Or did God simply say, Moses, I need you to write down all of these stories. I need you to write down my creation story right now so that it is preserved. Was it written by Moses alone, or were there other authors? There's always the question about Moses' death. How did Moses write about his own death? Through inspiration? Or did other authors contribute? And is it okay for other authors to contribute to a text in some way? Personally, I believe that the stories that were being told throughout the ages, Moses knew, and God inspired him to write these things down. I also believe that God can inspire other people to include scribes to come later on and clarify a text or be able to add something to the text that would edify the readers later on, especially us today. When we talk about later information, here's a couple of examples of where this comes in. We all have seen, or I think most people in this group, at least the group tonight, we've all seen the phrase Ur of the Chaldeans in the Genesis text. The problem with Ur of the Chaldeans is that the Chaldeans didn't exist until much after Moses. So now we're faced with this question. Critics of the Bible will tell us, see, this is why the Bible can't be trusted. So we're faced with this question. Did Moses write Ur of the Chaldeans through inspiration? Or did someone else add of the Chaldeans because by the time they were copying the text, by the time they were making sure that the message was preserved for future generations, there was a different Ur that existed in Syria. And they want to clarify that Ur that we're talking about here is Ur of the Chaldeans, Ur of the Mesopotamian area. The Ur that Moses went to was not the Ur of Syria, but the Ur of Mesopotamia. And is that okay? Can that be included? If you ask me, I think it's completely okay. I think that if God is able to inspire random authors that we have no idea who they are throughout the centuries to write a single book in our biblical text, that he can definitely inspire scribes to let us know what's what. Another example is Genesis 14, when it mentions the place of Dan. However, it's mentioning Dan in the context of Abraham. It's mentioning Dan, an area at the time of Abraham that can only be named Dan once his grandson is born and grows up and his people establish that area in Israel. This is an area that's really known as Laish at the time of Abraham. But an author later on says the people of our time doesn't know where Laish is. It's ceased to exist by thousands of years. Nobody back then had their iPhone where they could look up Laish and where is Laish? Oh, Dan. They didn't have that in the ancient world. So is it okay for a scribe to come along later on and say, this is really the area of Dan? Those are questions we have to come to terms with. So who wrote it? I would say Moses. My opinion, Moses wrote the book of Genesis, and other authors may have added some scribal notes to the text, and that's okay. When we look at this phrase down here, the last phrase under who wrote it, Ele Toldot. These are the generations. It's one of my favorite studies. There's 10 places. I'm pretty sure there's 10 places, if I remember correctly, in the book of Genesis where this phrase is used, Ele Toldot. And this is a phrase that comes right before what we understand to be mostly some of the most boring, boring sections of the Old Testament. It's where they list all of the generations. These are the generations. So what's going on there and why is that important? These generations are relayed to us sporadically throughout Genesis. But most scholars believe that this relaying of generations is evident of a story that's been passed down meticulously, that this story that we understand as Genesis, that goes from creation to the flood to Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, that these stories were passed down through the generations. So the story that Moses had, the story that I believe Moses wrote down, was a story that many people understood at that time, especially Moses, one who was learned in reading and writing on top of understanding the oral tradition, the oral stories that were passed down. So when was it written? We talk about the timeline of when biblical stories were written, and this one probably takes the cake. I would have to say it definitely takes the cake as far as when it was written. We're talking about 1500 BCE or 1300 BCE, depending on where you place Moses in the Exodus. 2,500 years after creation. That's a long time for these stories to be passed down. So what's the point? Why was it written? Why was it written so far afterwards? Why couldn't God have had Abraham write the story of Genesis? Why couldn't the story have been written by him and where it's at today? Why do we not understand that now? Why do we think that Moses wrote these? The world at the time when Moses lived was riddled with all kinds of creation stories. We have these three that I listed that are the most famous that we deal with is the Enuma Elish, Gilgamesh, and the Nuzi texts. These three stories are just an example of the most prolific stories at the same time that were being passed around. They are also stories that really mimic exactly what we have with the creation, the flood, and Abraham. Enuma Elish takes the story of these deities that creates the world, that takes man from dust, and instead of mixing it with water, mixes it with the blood of the gods that they defeated to create man, and spits on him to create him and animate him and make him whole. This flood story in Gilgamesh talks about the same thing that our flood story talks about, a worldwide flood, a single person that would be alive and his family to be able to restore creation. And Nuzi is almost identical to Abraham. When we come across these texts and we have critics who say, see, the Bible is no different than these texts. These texts were actually written much older. So the Bible's borrowing from their texts. Is that what's going on? Or did God choose to write his story at this time, at this moment, to be not in competition, but to put an end to all stories like this that were false? When we see these stories, we always focus on the similarities, and sometimes it can make us very uncomfortable. But when we focus on the differences, we can kind of see and understand the why. When we look at the creation story in Enuma Elish, we see chaos in creation. When we look at our creation story in our Bible, we see God bringing chaos and making order from it. We see him taking the chaos of creation, the chaos before creation, what had no order, and we see him giving divine order. We see man not a creation from the bloodshed of chaotic battles between deities, but we see one loving God creating man from dirt and water and breathing the breath of life into him. You see the creation stories of Genesis, they're a polemic. They're a contrast to the stories that were written at the same time or before. God is saying these stories that you have heard, they bear witness to false gods and a false narrative, but this narrative that I'm calling my people to write right now, right when you're seeing me do this great and mighty work, I'm delivering these people from Egypt. I've defeated all of their deities they thought would protect them. I'm bringing them through the water. I've calmed the sea and created calmness from the chaos of the waters. I've brought them through and delivered them. I've brought them through the wilderness for 40 years, and they're seeing these great and mighty works from these people, and the other ones know it. The other nations know it. We have many examples in the Bible where the other nations knew that God was doing this with his people. And then he says, now that you've seen that no other God that you have ever heard of can do the works that I've done, here's my story. This is how I brought creation to be. This is how I want to draw not just these people, but the rest of the people of the world towards me, to join this nation, to join in worship of me, the loving creator of this universe. The next example that we'll use is the example of Jeremiah, my other favorite. And these two highlight some of the most paramount stories in the Old Testament. Creation is by far the most well-known story in the Bible, probably. Children learn all about creation and Abraham and all of these stories from the time they're young. Jeremiah also records one of the most time-marking events in the nation of history for Israel, which is the destruction of the Second Temple the destruction of the First Temple and the exile into Babylon. So that I would use that one here, and of course weighing in on my love for Jeremiah. But when we look at Jeremiah as an example, who wrote it? So we kind of have a different storyline here than Genesis. We actually understand Jeremiah wrote it or a scribe wrote it. Which one wrote it? Who knows? Or I mean, it could have been either one. I would say Jeremiah actually wrote the text, and understanding when it was written. He had a scribe that went with him, but the text as a whole, in the finished product that we have today, I would say Jeremiah wrote it. More specifically, I would say it was written by him in Egypt. But who wrote it? We actually know the author, so it actually helps us pinpoint its time of composition, and that helps us understand the text within its culture. So when was it written? 586 is the destruction of Jerusalem and the initial, well, actually that's the final, the biggest exile of the people of Jerusalem or the people of Israel into Babylon. This was actually like the third wave of the exile. We had a couple smaller waves before this that took the leaders out first and took the prominent people out. And this is where they're going to come in. They're going to totally wipe out Jerusalem and lay waste to it, completely destroy it, and then they're going to take the third largest wave out of Israel and into Babylon. But when was it written? About this time, 586, maybe 585, when Jeremiah, we know from the text, he goes through a lot of hardships, but he's going to end up in Egypt, and we don't really see or hear of his death, which is an inclination of how solid the authorship is. We don't hear him. He doesn't record his death, but we know that it ends with him going to Egypt. But when we look at this book, why was it written? So we have to say, who was it written to? That is a question that should always be asked. It was written for us, but not to us, right? As we have established. Jeremiah's text is being written to the exiles, to those who had to flee or had to leave Israel and were brought into Babylon. It's written to those that went through some of the most horrible, atrocious events, the things that I can't even imagine going through. You're talking about the rape and pillage of your wives and daughters, the murder of your closest loved ones, and then being drug out in the most violent way and being carried off into Babylon. This is who the text was written to. So when we think about it from there, it adds a little more context. We think about the book of Jeremiah as this prophetic book that looks forward to Jeremiah 31, the new covenant. Jeremiah gets kind of slided in that context as if everything that he wrote was building up to that one moment. But the work as a whole was written to him, to those exiles. Kathleen O'Connor, my favorite scholar on the book of Jeremiah, along with, my mind's gone blank, another male scholar, but Kathleen O'Connor refers to this as the little scroll of consolation. I chuckle because it couldn't have been a small scroll. Jeremiah had to have been a large scroll, but this little scroll, this little book of consolation, it was written to a people for consolation after they had gone through all of these things. Brant Petrie. No, not him, not Brant Petrie. It was written to these people after they had gone through all these things. How is this when we read the first 20 chapters of Jeremiah and we see some of the most horrible things as reminders of what they went through? How is this a book of consolation? Kathleen O'Connor offers up a suggestion that what I keyed into, because today we use this method in counseling and therapy for people that have gone through traumatic events. This wave of poetry that happens in the first 20 chapters of going down and reminding the people of Jerusalem, of Judea, reminding them of the horrible things they witnessed, and then coming back up to this redemptive promise of God restoring a family, this metaphors of family and marriage and children, and then going back down to revisit the things they went through, and then coming back up. She offers that those first 20 chapters are written as a therapeutic manner to help them recover from the horrible events they went through. When we look at Jeremiah 31, because that is such a focal point in Jeremiah for the people today, we have to ask the same questions that we're asking today. When we read Jeremiah 31 and the promise of the new covenant, we have to understand that it was first written to the people in exile. We have to view, and this is how understanding this background to the Hebrew Bible can help us understand the fullness of the biblical message a little more. We have to understand that Jeremiah 31 and the promise of the new covenant was written to a people in exile in that day, that they would understand as something that meant something to them then and now. So when it promises this new covenant, when it says that I will bring back the people that I have sent to exile, I will bring them back to Israel, and I will make a new covenant with them, and I will restore what was lost. I will make this covenant that can't be broken like the one that their ancestors broken. That meant something to them then. When it says that I will place the law in their hearts, it meant something to them then. And that has to color the context of how we view the new covenant with us today. They wouldn't have viewed this placing of his law in their hearts as some eradication of any type of cognizance of the law itself as we've made it today. They would view it as this internalization of this renewing of this covenant that would bring them to a place that they would have no option but to obey from the sincerity of their heart and to obey the things that God had established before. So these are a couple examples of how we take the background and of each book. We can do this with every single book. We would fill a whole, matter of fact, I've had two classes on the critical introduction to the Old Testament, one at the master's level, one at the PhD level. And we literally go through every single book of the Old Testament and do this type of study and dig deeper and say, how do we know these things were written? What is it trying to tell us, and that type of thing? This can be done throughout. So I wanted to give you these things as an example of how to kind of start a study whenever you're going into a book. All right, so we're going to talk about the divisions of the Hebrew Bible and how we have them. We briefly touched on this the first week, just giving an overview. But this is what we have in the English right here. We have the Torah, the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy. We have the historical literature that follows. That's what we refer to that as, the other stories that are being told, Joshua to Esther. And we think about Joshua, that's the story of Israel going into the promised land. That's Esther is the story of Purim. It's the story of God protecting his people in the midst of political animosity. Then we have the poetic and wisdom literature. These are the Psalms, the Proverbs, Job, Song of Psalms, these things that are not so historical, but very poetic in nature. Then we have the prophets, Isaiah to Malachi. That's how our English Bibles are set up today. But this is how, this is how the Hebrew Bible is today still. If you look in a Jewish source, I have this JPS Tanakh. If you look in JPS Tanakh, it is arranged the same way. The Torah first, the law, the first, that's what the word Torah means, law, generally speaking. We'll talk about that word a little more. But you have that, the first 5 books, those books generally acknowledged to be written by Moses. You have the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketubim, the writings. So there's this fancy little picture out of my textbook over here. It kind of tells you this is an anachronism, Tanakh. So even today, even in scholarship, many professors will refer to the Hebrew Bible as the Tanakh. In Jewish circles especially, you will definitely see it referred to as the Tanakh. And this is where that word comes from. Tanakh is not a real word. It's an anachronism for the first letters, the first sounds of those 3 separations of the Hebrew Bible. So we'll look at that a little more in depth. this right here, I've got a few more pictures here, and this is kind of where um, they're coming out of my textbooks, so you have to forgive me. I try to find textbooks that I can get digital copies of, like Kindle, and I can get these pictures cleaned. But this one textbook that I like to use that has a lot of illustrations, it has no digital copy. So I'm literally taking pictures with my cell phone, cropping them, and putting them on here. But this is, excuse me, this is the structure of the Hebrew Bible. Um, and when we look at this, we're understanding that we have at least, I think 132 BCE, we have references to the Hebrew Bible being described in this manner, the law, the prophets, and the writings. We have the New Testament text. We have Jesus, Yeshua, the Messiah, referring to the Old Testament, referring to the Hebrew Bible as Moses, and the prophets, and all the other writings. So we understand both from the New Testament and from historical writings prior to that, that this was kind of a well-established structure of the Hebrew Bible at that time and even till today. So you have there in the first column, the Torah, the first 5 books, the prophets in the second column, and they're broken down differently than what we would think. We have the former prophets, we'll talk about that in a minute, and the latter prophets. And then you have the writings, which is generally speaking everything else, poetics, the what's referred to as the Megillot, the 5 scrolls, and the historical books. As we go forward here, we're going to look at each one of these individually, and this kind of gives us a more, just giving you a little bit more information on the Old Testament itself and what it meant to the people back then all the way through at least the first century. So when we look at this word Torah, I was given this word in a word study during a Hebrew reading class because my instructor knew my background. But when we look at this word Torah, it's generally referred to as law, and that's a misnomer. Some of you in the class looking at who's here tonight, you definitely understand that. But more specifically, this word means instructions or teaching. And even today, we're understanding it more to mean guidance and wisdom. It's not just law; it's guidance. We're trying to guide the people. These books were understood as being the requirements for becoming God's people. And when we know that God intended for His people to be drawn to Him, He's setting Himself apart from the rest of the deities around Him in the ancient world, and He's saying, I am different from those. I want to draw my people to me. A law code is not like that. It's also not built like that either. We'll talk about that in a minute. But later on in history, we have this reference, this Greek name, the Pentateuch, and it's referred to as the 5 books. Origen originally was the first person that we have record of referring to the Torah as the Pentateuch. It literally just means 5 books or 5 scrolls, depending on how you view it at that time. But we definitely understand these works to be one work, that we didn't necessarily have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that this was one story that was collectively written. And we'll talk about how we see these things connected. Well, we're going to talk about it right now. It's the next bullet. We see this as one work, and we view it as such because of something we call the Vav consecutive. I don't want to dive too much into the Hebrew, but there's a letter in Hebrew called the Vav. And it's just a little, it's very small. And when Vav is added to the beginning of a word, it's referred to as a Vav consecutive. It's like the word and, but it's generally speaking the same way we understand the word and today. It's a continuation of a thought that's already there. And so when we look at the Bible, we have the story of Genesis. The book of Genesis in Hebrew is referred to as Bereshit. That's the first word in the book of Genesis. There is no Vav there. It's just Bereshit, in the beginning. So you have the story of the Bible starting with this word Bereshit, and it means in the beginning. And there's some really neat studies you can look into just that one single word, but it's starting the story of what God wanted to tell us and people throughout creation to today, throughout history. But what does this Vav consecutive do? When we look at the biblical text, when we go from Genesis to Exodus, we see this Vav consecutive is the first one that's in there. I'm going to open this JPS text here. When we look, I should have put a picture here, but I just pulled this out right before we got started. When we go from Genesis to Exodus, and if you look in your Bible, I should pull up, I think I'll do that. This is a classroom environment. This isn't some type of sermon. I can be loose here with it. So I'm going to go to Exodus 1. You can do the same. Exodus 1:1. So if I look at my latest favorite version of the Bible, which is the Christian Standard Bible, it starts off, well, first of all, we have the book named the Exodus, but in Hebrew it's named Shemot. Shemot means names. So my version here, the CSB, starts off and says, these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. These are the names, right? So you could go from Genesis in our English Bible, you could go from Genesis to Exodus, and you could say, well, I have two books here. They're both got different titles, and they both start, but Genesis starts with in the beginning. Exodus starts with, these are the names of the sons of Israel. But when we look at the Hebrew, how it was written, when we look at Exodus, it says Va. Va. We have this Vav at the first letter in the book of Exodus. Vav is there. Va'elah, Shemot, B'nai Israel. These are the names of Israel. No. And these are the names of Israel. What does that tell you? This is one of my favorite parts of the Hebrew Bible. What does that tell you? This is a continuation of thought. When the author stops in Genesis, it's not a new story that gets started in Exodus. It's a continuation of thought. It's saying, and these are the names. Not these are the names. There's a big difference there. When we flip over to Leviticus, and you can do the same thing. And if you understand, a lot of people in the class tonight understand the Hebrew names of the Old Testament books. When you understand these names, you'll know what the name of Leviticus is, and some light bulbs ought to be going off. Vayikra. And the Lord called to Moses. And the Lord called to Moses. And then you go over to Numbers. I think my point is well established, but there you are. Vadaber. Vadaber Adonai. And the Lord spoke. So, and the Lord spoke. Again, in Numbers. And guess what? When you get through with the Old Testament, when you get through with the Torah, and you flip over to Joshua at the end of Deuteronomy, and we think, well, this is the end of Moses' writing, all right? This is the end of what Moses, his story was here, except for you go, and it was after the death of Moses. Joshua, again, a Vav consecutive. And this continues on throughout the story of the Bible. We have this Vav consecutive that continues the story, that says that these aren't separate stories. Even if they're separate authors, these stories are continuing the message that God has to say. One thing the Torah is not, it's not a law code. This is a quote from E. Carpenter, scholar of the Old Testament, says, the Torah comprises not only ancient legislation given through God's spokesman Moses, but also an equally impressive amount of historical narrative that forms the context for the legal material. Thus, the Torah is the most important section of the Jewish canon. We understand that the Torah became the foundation of the word, and the foundation of the Hebrew Bible, and the foundation of the Bible we have today. And the Torah was held of such high reverence at its time because it not only showed the story and the historical background of who God was, how he created, who he created, how he called his people to be, but then it tells the story of how God told his people to act. In the sense of being a law code, it's not a list of laws and legislation like we find in many other sources of the ancient world. It's a story that tells us this is what it looks like to emulate our loving Creator. The Torah also has narrative poetry, a very unique style of literature that's very much unique to the Bible itself. This poetic narrative that takes license in telling its story to add depth and meaning, and most especially emotion. We have the epic narratives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Most importantly, this section of the Bible is God drawing his people close to him, understanding it was written at a time when he just led his people from bondage. We know that he's drawing his people to him. All right, looking at the next division, the Nebaim, the prophets. So we have this broken down. You saw it on the graphic earlier, former and latter prophets. That's kind of a misnomer, because actually some of the quote unquote latter prophets were written at a time before the former prophets. But this is how they broke it down. It was kind of a chronological thing, but the former prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. It covers this entrance in the promised land all the way to the Babylonian exile. It's really referring to the historical timeline in the story. It's how we break down our English Bible. These are the historical writings. This is the history of Israel once they come into the land. And then the latter prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book of the 12. This is the 12 minor prophets, as some refer to them. These are the writing prophets. These are the people that they wrote their book. They're writing, most of these people are writing the book that at the time of their, it's not like the ones before. We have no idea of who wrote them. It's a historical thing. These are referred to as the writing prophets. It's God's message to the people during very much the same period of the former prophets. It's God saying, this is what I'm trying to tell you in this moment. So are the first ones, this is a big question. This was a question for me early on. Are these first ones, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, are these historical writings or are they prophetic writings? Well, when we look at the other writings, the writing prophets, we could almost ask the same question, because many of them open up with historical reference to what they're going to write about. So are those historical writings or prophetic writings? To the ancient world, to ancient Israel, there was no difference between the two. And we understand this now as we look at the Old Testament from our perspective in 2020, looking back through the lens of the New Testament somewhat, even though that's not how we should read it. We see and view these texts as historical texts that gave an inclination to what was to come. So they were prophetic in nature. But we understand this today in our modern culture and world because we have this phrase that we like to use that says, history repeats itself. So if we understand history to repeat itself, history itself is prophetic. And that's how they viewed these books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And lo and behold, these books were quite prophetic. Joshua tells the story of Israel coming in and crossing over the Jordan, entering their land, and what happens later on, but the people of the exile cross back over. They view their entrance back into Israel as the new Exodus. They view their crossing over of the Jordan as this new Exodus that was promised to them, that they would be returned back. Now, it doesn't happen because the people don't do what God said was a prerequisite for them to be fully restored. They don't fully turn their heart back to God. They won't even build his house before building theirs after he brings them back. We see the same concept when we get to the New Testament of, again, this historical story being prophetic when we view, and the authors of the New Testament project the story of Jesus' burial, death, burial, and resurrection as the new Exodus, as him as the new Moses, the one that was greater than Moses, the one that would usher in this greater exile. We see the story being recycled once again because history repeats itself. So what is a prophet? We hear this word, and if you're like me early on, we hear this word prophet and we think fortune teller, soothsayer, this, and there is a different word for seer and that type of work in the Bible. But the word prophet here, what does that word mean? We've come to know it as being the mouthpiece of God. These are the people that speak for God. Moses is referred to as a prophet because God spoke to him and then he speaks to the people for God. when we look at the prophets, looking at the latter prophets, we see that God animates their words by animation towards their mouths. Not every time, but sometimes. It says that he literally put the words into Jeremiah's mouth. But when we look at Ezekiel, he uses a metaphor of feeding him bread to say that he's putting the words into his mouth. So we not only understand them to be the mouthpiece of God because of what they do, but God very specifically animates himself towards their mouths to highlight this aspect. These people are speaking on my behalf. These people are saying what I tell them to. When you hear their words, you're hearing my words. Specifically speaking, and technically speaking, the word Navi, prophet, comes from Nabu. We talked about Akkadian, the different languages in the ancient Near East. Again, we're building here. We're seeing how these things all relate to each other. So Navi comes from this Nabu, an Akkadian, a language that predated Hebrew that means to declare or proclaim. And what do the prophets do but just that? All right, the last division here in the Hebrew Bible is the Ketubim. Now, this word comes from katav, which means to write. It was later on referred to as hagiographa, the holy writings. And it's, generally speaking, it's divided by its material type. What I mean by material type is the genre of literature that's happening in the text itself. So when we look at writings like, this is an example, Job, Psalms, and the Proverbs are linked together. Those are all seen as prophetic writings, and they're all seen as one text. I put this neat little thing here, just a tidbit of information. In the ancient world, they understood these, they referred to these three works right here, Job, Psalms, and Proverbs, as emet. And if anybody knows a little bit of Hebrew, we know that the word emet means truth. And they're taking the first letter of these three works, and they're putting together just like the Tanakh, Eyob, which means Job, Mishle, which is I wrote those backwards in the English from what they are right below, but Mishle is Proverbs, and Tehillim is the Psalms. So they're taking the first letter of those, and the first three letters in Hebrew are emet, truth. So they said these are the focal point of God's truth can be understood in these three texts. More than a third of the Old Testament is poetic. This is very unique. People don't think of this. A lot of people think, go ask anyone out there, do you read the Old Testament? Do you read the Hebrew Bible? No, it's just a bunch of old stories. It's just the historical background leading to the New Testament. Actually, 1/3 of the entire Old Testament is poetic. So what does that tell us? Even today, we understand poetry to be something that pulls on our emotions, that's calling us to react and respond to the writing emotionally. A poem can cause us to cry tears of happiness or sadness. Poems of lament can cause us to be angry for ourselves or out of empathy for the person who is writing it. So what's neat about the Bible, the Old Testament, the boring writings that some people refer to as being just the history of God's people, 1/3 of it is God trying to pull emotions out of you. 1/3 of it is God trying to get you to respond emotionally to what's being written. It's not so, when we think about it in that context, it's not so boring and historical. And then we have the 5 scrolls that come, the 5 scrolls that are part of this Ketubim. These are the Song of Psalms, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. What's unique is that all of these scrolls historically are read at different times of the year in the Hebrew calendar. Song of Songs is generally read at Passover, Ruth at Pentecost, Lamentations during the 9th of Av, which is the horrible historical year of Israel when both temples were destroyed and so many other things happened. Ecclesiastes read at the Feast of Tabernacles, and Esther, of course, read at Purim, which is the holiday associated with the book itself. And then later we have the historical works of Daniel, Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Now there's some questions concerned with these historical works, like why is Chronicles, when it tells generally the same story as Kings, why is it not looped with the former prophets? Why is Daniel not prophetic in nature? And why is Ezra, Nehemiah not the same? So we don't have a direct answer from the people that compiled the Hebrew Bible in the ancient world, but there's some little hints. Daniel himself was not a prophet. Daniel himself, though he spoke prophetically, was a statesman. He was a politician. So a lot of people believe that was the difference between where his book was placed in the biblical text. Chronicles was written from a different perspective much later to tell a different narrative or to show a different message of what was going on in Israel. Ezra and Nehemiah, these things have similar explanations. So, but they are placed here within the Ketubim. A couple more slides. We'll take a break. This is the names of the number of the Old Testament books. So we have 39 books in our English Old Testament or English Hebrew Bible, and those are listed on the far left column, just like they are the law, the historical text, poetry, and Proverbs. But then these other ones to the left tell you there's 36 books in the Hebrew Bible. There's 24 books in the Bible that Jerome composed, which would become the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, and 22 books according to Josephus. What's the point here? So we get bent around everything in this book being so dogmatically exact, when in the ancient world it wasn't necessarily so. The arrangement of the books may have changed. They may have understood them differently and labeled them differently, but the message is still the same, no matter how we rearrange these books and how they're listed. When we look at the differences here, most of them are going to be between how the books are combined. You look at the Hebrew Bible there, you'll see that Samuel and Kings are listed together as 2 books instead of 4. And even before that, I would suggest that all 4 were 1 book instead of 2. But you see that, so that takes away some more. Ezra, Nehemiah is going to be combined together in a couple places. I think Lamentations is not in a couple of areas. So you see some different things here. Ezra, Nehemiah's Chronicles is 1 book instead of 2. It's still the same story, but how they're understanding their arrangement is just a little different. This right here gives you the exact arrangement. Instead of talking about the numbers, it's telling you the arrangement of the books. So you have the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, which we said was, we established earlier in the class, was the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Interestingly enough, for it to have been translated from the Hebrew Bible, their arrangement is quite different. So they have something that looks much like what we have today, and that's because a lot of the later texts, the Vulgate and the English Bible, are drawing on the Septuagint tradition of the compilation of the books. But we have to ask ourselves why. Why was the Septuagint, why did it have a different arrangement when the Hebrew Bible it was coming from had 1 arrangement? The question and the answer may be that the Hebrew Bible they were using was arranged differently than the text that we have today. It's quite possible. All right, the names of Old Testament books. We didn't talk too much about names. I kind of briefly hinted at it, that some books are named for certain things that we may not think they're named for today. When we look at the book of Samuel, it's not written by Samuel. Ruth is definitely not written by Ruth herself, right? But these are just the different names. A lot of your differences come in the first 5 books. In the Hebrew, Bereshit is referring to in the beginning. And then later on, they're referring to the beginning, where they're saying Genesis, which generally means the beginning. But then some differences, like Exodus refers to the leaving. It's being named in the Septuagint, the Vulgate, and the English Bible. It's being named for the event that happens, the people leaving Egypt, whenever the Hebrew Bible takes the first few words of the book, and that's what it's named. And these are the names. Shemot. Names later on. When you look at Leviticus, and he called, but then later on it's referred to as Leviticus, this legislative, Levitical legislation. In the wilderness, Bamidbar in Hebrew, but later they're you kind of see a difference a flop in the naming here. You see the Septuagint and later referring to the first thing in the book, which is the numbering of the people, but then you have the Hebrew Bamidbar, which is in the first line, but it's referring more to the storyline there than you have Deuteronomy. So some other things, I think. I was trying to think of another one. Most of your prophets are all the same. There was one more that's escaping me right now that was named differently, and I can't remember what it is. Maybe you can find it on there. But the point being, these things were named differently throughout the history, but does the name of the book matter? Does it matter that we call Exodus and we don't call it Shemot? Not really. It's just a way to reference the book. We're just finding a way to reference the story that's being told. The importance is the words that are contained within each book and not so much the name of the book itself. All right. With that, we'll take a 10 to 15 minute break. We'll probably take a 10-minute break, 11 minutes. Come back at 20 after the hour, whatever time zone you're in. we are back, and I lost my place in the slideshow. So we took a break after the background to the Old Testament. So hopefully that gives you a little idea of what it looks like to investigate these books that we know as the books of the Old Testament, to understand its authorship. This class is not long enough for us to dive deep into the different intricacies of that, but it gives you a tool in your toolbox to say, when I go to study something in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, these are some questions I should ask before I even start studying it. I'm in a Bible study on Thursday mornings, and this week is our last chapter in the book of First Corinthians, if we get through the whole chapter this week. And the next book we're going to study is Genesis. So whenever, the person, my friend of mine who hosts the Bible study, he said, we're going to go back to Genesis. We're going to study from the beginning and see, study from there and study that book. I said, well, here's a great opportunity. We're a few weeks out. You should all read a book. I got this book. I'll share it in the end. It's called How to Read Genesis, by Tripper Longman, one of my favorite scholars. How to Read Genesis. It tells you exactly, or not exactly, it tells you how to approach Genesis, but you could find books like this for every single Bible. For every single book. How should we view this book? If you need resources for that, you can contact me. I can give you resources, but you can, Google, go to Amazon, look for books that'll open up how to study the book before you actually study it. We should be understanding who wrote it, when, where, why, how it was written. We should understand those things before we even dive into the book, if we're going to study it. If we're going to go study the book of Isaiah, we should study the background to Isaiah before we ever get into a study. Some scholars would say, and I would somewhat agree, that in that initial study of the book, because most of us study the same way, we study chapter by chapter. I'll read this chapter and study it. Then next week or tomorrow, I'll read this next chapter and study it. Part of your background initial study to a book before you dive into it should be an unbroken reading of the entire text. So if we're going to read Isaiah, we need to sit down, read the entire book of Isaiah unbroken, then go back, study the background to it, then start your study into it. There's another book I have here. It's called The Old Testament, a historical, theological, and critical introduction. So this is a big book. He does the work for each one of the books of what I said was more in depth to those questions that we were talking about, looking at who authorship was. He does it for the entire Old Testament here. This is my favorite critical introduction textbook for the Old Testament. There's another one for the New Testament. We'll talk about it next week, but it's on the last slide as well so that you can have reference to this and get it. But he takes each book in here. He starts off with some cultural background to the Old Testament itself. But then he goes into the books. And so for every single book, he goes from Genesis, Exodus. But when you open up to Genesis, he's going to give the name, the text itself, an outline of the text, a general overview of the text, just like we talked about. What's the background to the text? Read the story unbroken. What's the general overview? And then he goes into how to read Genesis, how to look at where the sources came from. He's a very conservative scholar, so I really like his work. He's not writing from a perspective that the Bible is not to be trusted in its authorship. But we'll get into those. But that's a couple of resources that you can use whenever you're going in to study a book. I keep the Old Testament Critical Introduction by Richard Hess. I keep that really handy because every time I'm digging into an Old Testament book, I'm pulling that book out first to guide me and study the background. So next, we're going to talk about the transmission of the Old Testament text. And we may not get through all of this today. As a matter of fact, we won't get through all of this today, but next week's New Testament will be a little shorter, and we'll just bleed this. We'll finish this out next week. We'll go through about 500 CE and discuss this, and then we'll take a break this week and pick up next week. So when we talk about the transmission of the Old Testament text, we're talking about how it was passed down, how all of these books were passed down from one to another. So Moses wrote the Torah. If we are establishing that Moses wrote the Torah, how was that passed down? How did the text of the Old Testament of the Torah, the first 5 books, how did it get from the hands of Moses to our Bibles today? That's really what we're talking about whenever we're talking about the transmission of the Hebrew Bible. One problem that we have, and this is not just with the Old Testament, it's not with the Hebrew Bible, it's that we have no original manuscripts. So what we refer to these as, we refer to them as autographs. So a manuscript, I kind of have that backwards, but a manuscript means simply that which is written by hand. So when we're talking about manuscript, we're talking about all of the Old Testament texts, and as we go into the New Testament, we're talking about it as well. We're talking about those texts that were copied down by hand from the scribes of the ancient world. They're copying from an earlier text. They're copying on to a new text to keep passing this word down. But what we don't have is what we call is referred to as autographa, but it's autographs. We don't have the autographs. These are the original manuscripts. We don't have the very text that Jeremiah wrote. We don't have the very text that the authors of Psalms wrote. And that can be a problem to some, right? I mean, it's not necessarily a problem to me and that's what I hope as you study this class, I hope that you come to the same conclusion, that it's not an issue when people say, well, there's no, you don't have an autograph of the letter of John, the Gospel of John. You don't have an autograph of Genesis or Deuteronomy or Isaiah, that's not an issue because logic would have it. You can just simply say, well, no, duh, right? We'll talk about that below, but well, we don't have a printing press till the 15th century BCE, and I mean that should be CE. I'll change that. Matter of fact, I hate to leave a slide messed up there. I will change that right now because this is a class and we can do that. All right, let me get my. I gotta get back to my slide. All right. We don't have the printing press till the 15th century CE. So everything we have before that is literally what's being written by hand, whether it's the Old Testament text in Hebrew, whether it's the Septuagint in Greek, whether we get to the Vulgate and we're writing these things down in Latin, these things are being written by hand. So that comes with its own problems, but it also comes with its benefits really too. The printing press comes along, and if you watch the movie from the first week, that movie kind of goes into this printing press and the production of Bibles that would lead to what we have today, which is over, I forgot what it is now, over 100 million every year, 100 million copies produced and sold every single year. So, but back then it wasn't the same thing. You didn't have this printing press, much less these electronic versions and all that we have today. Again, technology. What was the biggest enemy of the Old Testament text was obviously these 3 things: age, decay, and destruction. So we talked about the writing materials, and we didn't just learn about writing materials so that we could know about writing materials. We learned about writing materials so that we could understand why that plays an important role in the history of the text. Why don't we have the original manuscripts, the autographs of Moses writing of the Torah? Because it's illogical and unrealistic to think that these autographs that were written on papyrus and parchment, that they would have survived that long. Who could have them, or how could we have them? When we look at the oldest text we have from of the Hebrew Bible anyway, we look at the oldest text we have of the Hebrew Bible from the Dead Sea Scrolls. We only have those things because they were meticulously stored and hidden for a certain purpose, and we just so happen, right? There is no just so happen. There's an old phrase, Jehovah just so happened. God just so happened to show us or bring those about, but those came about by a pure miracle, really, that we have texts that old. Much less will we have texts from the time of Moses. I would ask again, outside of I would ask anyone that brings up this issue, outside of stone inscriptions, really, what other stories do you have from that time that are passed down? We have plenty of stone writings, clay tablets, but you're talking about the Bible. That was huge stories that were written down that we just don't have the clay tablets. These were written down by originally nomadic people. There's some other things. Well, we do have one inscription, this silver, what's referred to as a silver amulets. They come from about mid 7th century BCE, and it's just a silver amulet that was some type of jewelry or whatever, and it's got portions of number 6. I think it's really small and really hard to read, but if I remember correctly, it's portions of number 6. Although some people think it was like inspired by number 6, but not exactly like that, but it's clearly a portion anyway is from number 6. But why was it preserved? Why do we have it and nothing older than it? Well, because it's silver. It's not the papyrus and the parchment and animal skins. This is a metal that can be with that can stand the test of time. So what else do we have? These dates here, 722, 721. If anyone knows what that is, that's the Assyrian conquest of the northern parts of Israel that brought destruction. 586, one of the most destructive things in Israel's history was the destruction of Jerusalem. 70 of the Common Era, again, we have the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and the burning of the city and everything within it. So you have to overcome these things as well. These texts were stored in these major cities. We didn't have a lot of scrolls that could be just passed around. We didn't have everything saved to a phone or a jump drive or external hard drive that could just be snatched up and taken with. You were running for your life and you left behind everything. This is really the context of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were coming into Israel for destruction prior to the 1st century, and so they're hiding these scrolls, trying to hide them so they won't be destroyed. That's exactly what's going on. So you have these big, huge events in the history of Israel that really accounts for the destruction of very fragile texts. Then you have another thing too. You have this reverence for the name of God. You have this reverence for the name of God. I don't want to get into the details too much about that, but you have this idea that God's name is holy, that it can't be spoken. In the Hebrew text, they get to a point very early. They get to a point where they're changing the way they're writing the name of God so that you would see the name, you would mentally think of the name, but you would verbalize Adonai. You would be saying something other than the name out of reverence for the name. You don't want to misuse the name. They had so many enemies around them. They did not want the enemies of Israel to take a text that contained his name, the name of God, and defile it. To this day, a lot of different people groups still revere the name the same way, to the point that they will not place a Hebrew Bible on a table and place another book on top of it, because now you're placing something on top of a book that contains the name of God. This reverence still exists today. But what they would do in the past, you would have these texts that, like we say, they would age and decay, and they would be wearing out, not being able to be used. They become very brittle, as we talked about before. And because of the name, they wouldn't just discard these. They wouldn't leave them on the shelf, crumpled up. They would put them in this place, the Geniza. And the Geniza was, which means like the hidden place. They would hide them away. And when you got enough of them, they would take them out, and they would go through this ceremony of destroying the scrolls so that they could not be defiled or misused. So we have a famous Geniza that we found called the Cairo Geniza. It's in Cairo, Egypt. And there's a lot of old texts, ancient texts in there that we've drawn from. We'll talk about some of those later. But those Geniza, that's another reason why we don't have those texts. They're being destroyed by the very people that wrote them. This, by the way, is the whole purpose of having to carry on the scribal traditions, of having to write new texts, is because the old texts are wearing out. And then you have those who wish to destroy the text. You have the enemies of the prophets, the very Israelites themselves that don't want to hear the prophets' words, seeking to destroy not just the prophets, but the words that they wrote. You have the enemies of Israel later on You talk about the Bar Kokhba revolt and different things like that, where they wanted to destroy not just the people, but the very text that they hold. When we talk about the different breakdown of the Old Testament, you have the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. When the Israelites are taken into captivity, they had no restrictions necessarily on their worship. They were allowed to have some religious texts, but they could not have the Torah. There was an aversion towards the Torah because it was a law of another nation. It would be like us going into captivity in Iraq and trying to live by American laws and legislation. It just wouldn't happen. So they viewed the Torah as a threat to their system of government. So you had this destruction of those books while they could have other books. That's why Jeremiah could be written and sent to them, because other books were welcome. So all of these things really play into when someone says, well, you don't have any old text, you don't have any autographs of the Old Testament, you can say, no, duh. It doesn't make sense. It's illogical to even think we would have those. It's illogical to think that nomadic people that were wandering the desert, dry, arid areas would be able to preserve these texts in that time. But the scribes carried on the tradition of writing down these writings for us to have today. So, and by the way, we have, because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have some of the most ancient, by far the most ancient and the most the highest volume of manuscripts of our text than really any other ancient text. So, all right, we're going to kind of talk about, we're going to go from prior to 100 CE, so going, or AD, however you want to call that, the Old Testament text prior to that. Next, we'll start to discuss up to 500 AD, or of the Common Era, and then we'll kind of take a stopping point there, and we will pick up next week. Looking at the time, that's about what we have. So when we think of the Old Testament text, at least the Hebrew text, the Hebrew Bible, prior to the 100 CE, not much was known about it up until recently, and really that comes with the and I say much recently, you're talking about the last 20 years. Even though we found the Dead Sea Scrolls back in 1949, it takes a while for those scrolls to become readily available for study, to be worked with, rolled out, and preserved in a way that we could start really studying those texts. It takes a while for scholarship to study the text, do the translation work. We're talking about some texts that are written in Block Hebrew, but you've got some texts written in Paleo Hebrew, if you remember that from last week. So different texts. We have some texts that have a mixture of both. So it takes a while for all that stuff to literally and figuratively iron itself out. We did have the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint and the Nash Papyrus. The Samaritan Pentateuch, I think I briefly mentioned it. I don't know that I've actually said what it was. There was a people we know from the New Testament, the Samaritans, and north of Jerusalem and moving up into that northern area of Israel. They had their own Pentateuch, their own first 5 books of Moses. There were some differences there. That's kind of a context to the discussion that Jesus has with the woman at the well. And they had their own text, and they still have very, very old manuscripts of their text. But it's different, but we knew a little bit from studying that text. We can see a little bit about the language anyway. The Septuagint, the Greek translation, tells us some of the things that we need to know about how the people were viewing the text at that time. When they're doing translation work, the words they choose in Greek definitely give us some context to how they understood the Hebrew Bible. We didn't talk about Nash Papyrus, but it's just another text that's allowing us to see some context. But outside of that, we didn't really have much till we get to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they're abbreviated DSS. You'll see that written a lot of times, but it's about from 250 BCE to 50 CE, or if you view that 250 BC to 50 AD. That's the area that these scrolls were written in. They cover that time period. So we went from a place where we had the Masoretic text, which was the oldest Hebrew version of the Hebrew Bible that we had, that's on up into the 10th century AD. Now you're backdating our oldest Hebrew text to 1,000 years before, 1,200 years before, depending on the text you're reading. And what's so interesting about the comparison of the Dead Sea Scrolls to what we had is that they were very similar, almost identical in some places. You compare the Isaiah scroll, the Dead Sea Scrolls, to what we have in the Masoretic text. You virtually have no errors, but scribal errors that we know and can attest to. And we'll see moving forward, we'll see why we have such a meticulously recorded text from that 1,000-year period. So what do we know about, the language of Hebrew from this era, from 100 CE prior to, and what I mean by this question, I'm not even referring to even close to the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm talking when we think about the language of Moses, when we think about the writings during the monarchies of Israel, when we think about those texts, what do we know about the language? Is it Paleo Hebrew? Is it, we kind of have some inscriptions that attest to Paleo Hebrew being as far back as the 9th and 10th century BC, and as far forward as the 3rd century BC. But was that the text of the Bible? Was it written in that text? Was it written in Proto-Canaanite or Proto-Sinaitic? We don't really know. The interesting thing about the most ancient inscriptions of Hebrew is that we don't really have any evidence of what was written and how. We have some old inscriptions. We have some old Aramaic. We have some formulations of the language back then. But is that exactly how the Hebrew Bible was written? We don't really know. And why I say that is because in Israel's history, they treated the biblical text much different than any other text. So we can find some scrolls. One question is, was Hebrew, we talked about Greek, how the earliest Greek was uncials, it was all capital letters and no spaces in between. Is that how the Hebrew was? Was Hebrew no spaces in between? We have some examples where Hebrew, especially in the Paleo Hebrew text, are used with no spaces in between. But is that how the Bible was written? We don't have an example of that. We have Hezekiah's tunnel. If you've been to Israel and been to Hezekiah's tunnel, there's some inscriptions in the tunnel. Those are written in, I think, Paleo Hebrew. Yes, they have dots in between the words. So while there's no clear space in between the words, there's a dot to signify the different words. Was the Bible written that way? Did it have dots? We don't know. Because we can't assume that the inscriptions in Hezekiah's tunnel warranted the same type of inscriptions as they would have done for the biblical text. Where does that, why does that play? We'll look here below, but there's a reason why that question plays a role. So one thing to remember is we have no manuscripts prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have the Septuagint, which in some cases predates the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we really don't have any Hebrew texts that old of the biblical narrative text, the books we call the Old Testament. So we have to do some work historically to see. Now, when we think about that idea, it can draw some questions or concern. If the oldest text of the Old Testament we have is the 1st to the 3rd century BCE, how can we trust this text? Well, that goes back to, while we're learning this material, we're learning the why. We understand that those texts couldn't survive, but we also understand the providence of God to allow that text to be the oldest withstanding text of all Hebrew, of all ancient stories and books. So hopefully that builds up your faith and doesn't add a question to it. We have from the amulets that we talked about, these the silver amulets. We're talking about these small silver amulets with a blessing on it that we talked about a while ago. Those were written in Paleo Hebrew with no division. There's no division of words there. There's no space between words. Again, that's somewhat of a biblical text, right? We're talking about Numbers 6. So now we can say, well, is this text written the same way as the Bible? Because it's a biblical text. Would it be given the same reverence with no space using Paleo Hebrew? We still don't know, because we're talking about a very small amulet where space was not provided for very much writing. So is it being written the same way there as it would be on a scroll? That's just questions to ask and understand. You may be saying, why does it matter if we understand how the Old Testament was written? when we go from the Paleo to the square Hebrew, the block letter Hebrew that we know today, we understand that transition took place in about 3rd to 5th century, and part of this amulet to the Dead Sea Scrolls helps us paint that picture of the progression of Hebrew. But when we think about word divisions, I give a couple examples here. So God is now here. This is using the English language. God is now here. But if I have no spaces, I have to think, and I should put an example without spaces. I'll matter of fact, well, I just did it. No, I'm not going to go back now. But if that sentence had no spaces, I would have to question and discern from the context of where it's written, is that intended to say God is now here or God is nowhere? So that's why it's important. We understand that's just an example in Hebrew. Here's a real example from the Bible. Amos 6:12 says, "Do horses run on the rocky crags? Does one plow with oxen?" Now, this is a poetic reference from the prophet Amos, but the way poetry works in this double, those lines are actually one on top of each other. And when it's asking questions like this in Hebrew poetry, the answer is the same. It's doubling down on its answer. But the problem with Amos 6:12 is, do horses run on the rocky crags? No, they don't. No horses run on the rocky crags. Does one plow with oxen? Yes, actually, one does plow with oxen. And if you keep going in the verse, the answer should be no, but it's not no there. One does actually plow with oxen. So what do we do with this text? We have the New American Standard. They added a word. This is kind of pushing us forward to where we'll be in a couple of weeks with different translations of the Bible. But this is why you got to have a little leniency on our translators. Understand the task that they have is not easy. So the NASB translators, they add the word them. They say, does one plow them with oxen? Meaning, does one take oxen and plow the rocky crags? The NIV adds the word there, same thing. Does one plow there on the rocky crags with oxen? Well, here's the real situation from the Hebrew that might exist and give some context to how the ancient Hebrew text was. When we look at this word Baba Kareem, which would mean plow with oxen, but we take the same exact Hebrew letters and we add a division right there at the end. Baba Kar Yam. That would mean, does one, and I put oxen. I shouldn't put oxen, I don't think. That shouldn't be with oxen. That would mean, does one plow the sea? So we have a difference between spacing that could mean, does one plow with oxen or does one plow the sea? Yam means sea. That's how important it can be for understanding our text. Now, a text that made no sense within Hebrew poetry, and a text that doesn't require the translators to add words that aren't there. Because if we're going to add them or there's Hebrew words that can be added to make that make sense. Now, we don't have to do that. We could say maybe, possibly, Hebrew didn't have spacing in the most ancient text, and maybe they did have spacing, and maybe the scribe placed the yam too close to the babakar. Just a little context there. So we're getting close to wrapping up here. We won't even make it to 500 CE. 500. But when we look forward at the Old Testament text, when we look at the scribal work, and this kind of slide here is looking at what scribes did to the text and give us inclinations of certain things. You had from 500 BCE to 100 CE, you had this group called the Sopharim, and these people were like it says here, the early scholars were called Sopharim because they used to count all the letters of the Torah. So we start seeing this meticulous nature of recording happening back as far as 500 BC. Now, we don't have text from that time, right? The oldest text we have really come from about 250 BCE, but we know historically that these Sopharim were there at that time, meticulously counting every single letter of the Torah. This preservation. This wasn't like me and you sitting down and copying lines from a book or someone else's notes. This was given the utmost reference. This was, reverence. This was given the most reverence that you could think of when copying these texts. They were counting every letter. If they got to the end of a page of that would be used in a scroll, and they count these letters and it's missing a letter or adding a letter, the whole work is scrapped and started over because they did not want to miss a letter. So we get this idea of the scribal work that was going on, at least in that era, the oldest era we have attestation to, as being very meticulous. Jeremiah 36 gives us an inclination of the scribes themselves. We talked about this a little bit before, but I thought I would add it here because it gives context to the scribal work that was going on. It starts off with God telling Jeremiah, take a scroll and write on it these words. So he's going to write this scroll and he's going to take it to the king. And when it gets there, it says, whenever Jehudi had read 3 or 4 columns of the scroll, the king cut off with a scribe's knife and threw them into the fire pot until the entire scroll was burned in the fire. Now, I've always viewed this text, and I think it still can be viewed, this portion of Jeremiah, as being, he's trying to bring a word of God that's disregarded. But what for us, in trying to understand how these texts were written, they had to be handled. These scrolls had to be handled, and they were very inconvenient. So what's he doing here? We understand him to be cutting the scroll and throwing it in the fire, but we also understand a very, very detailed view of what was going on with the texts themselves when we view this. It's hard for him to handle it. He could have easily, if he has a book, he could easily read this book and toss the book in the fire. But because they were so hard to handle, he's having to cut the portions of the scroll and toss them in the fire. One thing the ancient scribes did, we have examples from 2 Chronicles 36 and Ezra 1. The end of 2 Chronicles is the beginning of Ezra. It's repeated, but it gives them a place to reference back to and know where they ended and where they should start. We have this happening in the modern era of printing and transcriptions in England, Old England, where they would write at the bottom of a page, they would write the kind of the opposite of here. At the bottom of a page, they would write the first few words of the next page. This would help them understand whether a page was missing or something like that. We have page numbers now that help us do that, but they would do the same type of thing. This is what scribes were doing to keep their place, and we have example of that from 2 Chronicles to Ezra. Something that was a scribal notation ends up becoming part of the text of Ezra. And then we have, when scrolls were rolled up, usually the scroll name and the authors would be placed on a small little piece on the outside. Kind of, we would do the same thing today. If we rolled up a note, we would tape it shut. If we're trying to make our own scribe, we would have some tape or something that would last. But their stuff wouldn't last. I mean, they didn't have Scotch tape. They didn't have masking tape. So a lot of times these things would fall off. The one example I could think of was Hebrews, the book of Hebrews. This is a New Testament text, obviously, but the same thing would have most definitely happened with some Old Testament scrolls. And why I think this is important, some of the scrolls we have no attestation to the authorship of the scroll may very well have been understood in its time, but was lost. The book of Hebrews is one really good example. We don't know the author of Hebrews. Some would say it's Paul. I think that idea is kind of fading away, basically because the letter is written very much differently than all of Paul's other writings. But no doubt the book of Hebrews may have had a scroll or a codex, and this thing would have had this small slip of paper. We found these small slips of papyrus or parchment and would have had the author's name, the name of the book or whatever, and been sent out. And somewhere along the line, that very thing is lost from the book of Hebrews. We know that the book was not, the letter itself was not intended to be unknown by the people that were reading it. It was not intended to be anonymous in nature from its writing, because the author is writing to a people that know him. But we today don't know because we've lost that aspect of it. So what was the original, the origin of the scribal text? There's two main views here. The scholars are down below there, but when we look at the Masoretic text, the later Hebrew text that we have, did it come from a bunch of different sources? That's on the left-hand side, that's on the right-hand side. We'll start on the left. do you have the Masoretic text that begins with a single source, a single origin, and it's dispersed out, and you have all these differences later, or is the Masoretic text compiling a bunch of what they call vulgar text? Is it compiling all of these different old inscriptions or scribal compilations of the text of the Old Testament and putting them together and correcting all the things that they see wrong in the text? I don't really have an opinion either way. I think God can work within the inspiration, but this is just to give you an idea that there's two thoughts of how these texts came about. Was there one main text that was being held together and sacred? We know early on from like Deuteronomy, the books were held close to the Ark of the Covenant. Was there a main text that all these scribes are copying copies of that text, and then you end up with all these differences? Or did you have a bunch of different texts, and then the Masoretes come about and try to compile one authoritative text while correcting the errors? That's just to give you an idea of two different thoughts there. We're getting close here. The Old Testament text prior to, when we talk about Hebrew vowels, so Hebrew was an abjad language. This is a language without vowels. There's only consonants. And what some of the things that we think are kind of vowels today in Hebrew really weren't vowels. They were gutturals, like the aleph. The aleph in Hebrew today really takes on what we would call, it just takes on, it's silent. The aleph is silent and takes on the verbal, the vowel pointing that it's associated with. But anciently, no doubt, the aleph was a guttural. It was something in the back of your throat. It was a sound that was actually formed and joined with whatever vowel, what we would call a vowel. But there was no vowel text, no vowels within the text. Ancient Hebrew and modern Hebrew is just consonants. Today we have the different dots and the dashes to let us know what vowels to form, but anciently they didn't have that. Now, about during the monarchy, the 9th to 10th century BCE, it's understood that the hey, the yod, and the vav especially were being added to the text. They were being added to words. This is called matris lectionis. What's that mean? Mother of the books or whatever. This is like a guiding for the reader to know how to pronounce certain words. Even today, we have these hey, yods, and vavs understood at the end of Hebrew words. They give context to not just the pronunciation of the word, but also context to its form of the word and what it's trying to say. We understand the Masoretic text today to be quite old, that it's, the copies we have are from 9th, 10th century, but we understand it to have been compiled in the 2nd or 3rd century based on its use of this matris lectionis. The Samaritan Pentateuch and the Qumran texts, they use this same method within their text as well. Now, the texts that use this matris lectionis, this is kind of getting a little detailed, but they were referred to as plenty or full writings, and the other ones that don't use it were defective. They became so prevalent that really becomes part of the Hebrew text as we move towards the 1st century. I think this is, I'm going to skip through this. We'll get to this next week. We'll pick up here with the standardization of the text and how we can view the reliability of the text and moving forward from the 1st century, 2nd century of the Common Era forward. So here are some references. These are a couple of few books that you could view. The World Around the New Testament. I think I pulled that book in here. This is a very good book, very easy to read, by Bill Arnold, great scholar, Brent Strawn. This book has given you the context of the Old Testament, the world around. It's literally talking about the world around it, what was going on outside of Israel at the time that these texts are being written. So it goes through the Amorites, the Assyrians, Babylonians, Egypt, Hittites, all that stuff. Very good book to understand the context of your Old Testament. How to Read Genesis. That was a book I referenced by Tripper Longman. It gives you an idea of how you can approach every single book. Genesis being the foundational book of the Bible, I think you should start with this one. but it gives you an idea of how you can approach each book. Jeremiah, Pain and Promise. This is Kathleen O'Connor's writing. Very short, very easy read, but very impactful read on Jeremiah and how to understand it. And of course, I shared Old Testament from Richard Hess earlier. Again, these are just books. A couple of people asked me after the last two classes, I keep referencing books and how to get the list of them. So I'll start doing this kind of anything that I reference or use during a class, I'll put at the end of the class. This is not required reading for the class, but if you want to do some other study or add to your library, these are good things here. So with that, for the night, we are right at 9 o'clock. Does anybody have any questions whatsoever? And you can unmute your mic or you can type a question real quick, either way. All right. Well, I'll take that as no questions. I appreciate your time. I will definitely get, last week I was on the road to Fort Knox. Definitely get the recording up tonight and post it in the group, and discussion questions will be posted by tomorrow. We didn't have much discussion on the questions this week, probably because I think it was technical issues. I thought I had posted them on Monday, but then someone said they weren't there. I posted them again on Wednesday. So, but the discussion questions are there for you, the class, to discuss and learn from each other and see, you know, how we're viewing different things and how we view the material here in the class. Everybody's opinion is worth it. I may learn something from you. You may learn something from your classmate and his or her comments or opinions. So please participate in that. The reading this week, I'll tell you ahead of time, will be the next 3 chapters. So this reading this past week was the first 3 chapters in the book. The reading this next week will be the next 3 chapters. So chapters 4 through 6 will be this week's reading, and the questions will come from the material here and the material in the book. So I appreciate your time tonight, and for those that will watch later, and I hope you have a great week. Next week, now that I'm thinking about it, next week class will be on Monday night instead of Sunday. We do have a church function, but that should be the only interruption throughout the class period. But next Monday night instead of Sunday. I'll post it in the group as well. Thank you again. I appreciate you. Hope you all have a great week. Oh, hang on. I do have a chat. It just says, thank you. You're welcome. I hope it was edifying. So we'll talk to you all soon. Thanks.